Eleanor Whitfield had stopped counting the years since anyone had looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he finds beautiful. She was 68 years old, and for the last 12 of those years, she had lived alone in a small stone cottage at the edge of Briarwood Village, with a garden she loved more than most people, a cat named Mr. Biscuit, and a quiet sort of peace she had taught herself to be grateful for. Her husband, Thomas, had died of a sudden heart attack when she was 56. After the funeral, after the flowers had wilted and the casseroles from neighbors had stopped arriving, Eleanor had simply gone on. She taught children to read and write at the village primary school until she retired. She tended her roses. She visited her granddaughter Margot on Sundays. And somewhere along the way, without ever deciding it on purpose, she had accepted a quiet truth that everyone around her seemed to agree on. Love was for the young. Romance was for people who still had decades ahead of them to enjoy it. Women her age were meant to fade gently into the background, to become grandmothers and aunts and kind old neighbors, not women who still dreamed of being held. Her sister-in-law, Diana, reminded her of this often, usually without meaning to be unkind, though the words stung all the same. "You had your great love, Eleanor," Diana would say, sipping her tea with the confidence of someone who believed she was offering comfort rather than a verdict. "Thomas was a good man. You were lucky. Most women don't even get that much. But that part of your life is finished now. It's time to enjoy your grandchildren, and let the young ones have their turn at romance." Eleanor never argued. What was there to argue? It seemed to be the truth that everyone accepted, the way people accepted that summer turned to autumn, that the tide went out and did not stay. So when Margot called her on a Tuesday evening, breathless with excitement, to invite her to the Hartmore Hall charity gala, Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. "I have nothing to wear, darling, and I would only sit in a corner," Eleanor said, already imagining the evening, long rows of beautifully dressed guests, music she didn't recognize, and herself, invisible, watching the world go by from a folding chair near the punch bowl. "Grandma, please," Margot said. "I'm helping organize it. I need a friendly face there. And besides, you have that lovely blue dress you wore to my graduation. You'll look wonderful. Just come for an hour. If you hate it, I'll personally drive you home myself." Eleanor smiled despite herself. Margot had her grandfather's gift for gentle persistence, the kind that wore down resistance not through pressure but through warmth. In the end, Eleanor agreed, mostly because she could not bear to disappoint the one person in her family who still looked at her as though she were interesting rather than merely old. The evening of the gala arrived gray and cool, with a soft autumn mist settling over the hills as Eleanor's taxi wound up the long gravel drive toward Hartmore Hall. The estate rose out of the mist like something from a storybook, its stone walls glowing amber in the light spilling from dozens of tall windows. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with nerves she hadn't expected. It had been a very long time since she had walked into a room full of strangers wearing anything other than her gardening boots. Inside, the ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers threw soft golden light across polished floors. A string quartet played near the far wall, and waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne. Eleanor smoothed the front of her blue dress, suddenly very aware of every line on her hands, every gray hair she hadn't quite managed to hide. Diana was there too, of course, dressed in deep burgundy and holding court near the dessert table, with a small group of women from the county committee. She spotted Eleanor almost immediately and made her way over, her smile bright and a little too sharp. "Eleanor, how brave of you to come," Diana said, kissing the air near Eleanor's cheek. "Don't worry, dear. No one expects you to dance. You can just enjoy watching the young people. That's the best part of these events when you reach our age, watching from the chairs. Isn't it lovely? Eleanor forced a smile and said nothing, though something small and tired inside her chest ached at the words. She found a seat near the edge of the room, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, and settled in to do exactly what Diana had suggested: to watch. The gala, she soon learned, was being hosted in honor of the local children's hospital, and the man responsible for it all was the owner of Hartmore Hall himself, Duke Alistair Hartmore, a name Eleanor had heard mentioned around the village, but had never actually seen in person. People spoke of him the way people speak of mysteries they have stopped trying to solve. He was said to be reserved almost to the point of coldness, a man who had withdrawn from society entirely since the death of his wife Catherine, 3 years earlier. Some said he hadn't danced once since her funeral. Some said he never would again. Eleanor saw him for the first time standing near the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, watching the room with an expression that struck her immediately as familiar. It was not boredom, and it was not disdain. It was loneliness, the particular kind that comes from standing in a crowded room and feeling like the only person who remembers what it was like to not be alone. He was tall, with silver hair brushed neatly back, and the kind of quiet, unhurried bearing that came from a lifetime of not needing to prove anything to anyone. Eleanor watched as 3 different women approached him over the course of the evening, each younger, each lovelier in the conventional sense, each offering a warm smile and a hopeful invitation to dance. Each time, the Duke declined politely, with a small bow and a few quiet words, and returned to his place by the window, alone again. Eleanor found herself studying him, not with romantic interest, exactly, but with something closer to recognition. She knew that posture. She had worn it herself for 12 years. It was nearly 9 o'clock when something extraordinary happened. The quartet began a slow waltz, the kind of melody that seemed to belong to another century entirely, and Eleanor watched as the Duke set down his wine glass, straightened his jacket, and began walking, not toward the cluster of young women near the dance floor, not toward Diana's group with their polished laughter and county gossip, but directly across the room, toward her. Eleanor's heart gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. Surely he was walking toward someone behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was no one there, only the wall and a tall potted fern. When she turned back, the Duke was standing in front of her chair, his expression calm but his eyes unusually bright. "Forgive me for the interruption," he said, his voice low and warm, with the slightest formal edge to it. "I have been standing by that window for the better part of an hour, trying to find a reason to stay at this party, and I find that you are the only person in this room I actually want to speak with. Would you do me the honor of a dance?" For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at him, certain she had misheard. Around them, conversations had quieted. She was aware, distantly, of Diana's face among the crowd, frozen in open astonishment, her teacup paused halfway to her lips. "I think you must be mistaken," Eleanor finally managed. "There are far younger, far more—" "I did not ask for younger," the Duke interrupted gently. "I asked for you." Something in his voice, not flattery, but plain, simple honesty, made Eleanor's protest die in her throat. She rose from her chair on legs that felt strangely unsteady, placed her hand in his, and let him lead her onto the dance floor. She had not danced in over a decade. Her feet remembered the steps before her mind did, falling into the rhythm of the waltz as the Duke guided her with an easy, practiced grace. For the first minute, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to fall away around them, the watching crowd, the clink of glasses, even Diana's stunned expression. until it was only the music and the warmth of his hand at her waist. "I imagine you are wondering why I crossed the room for a woman I have never met," he said finally, a faint smile touching his mouth. "The thought had occurred to me," Eleanor admitted. "My wife loved this song," he said. "We danced to it at our wedding, 40 years ago. Tonight, when it began to play, I looked around this room full of people half my age, all of them so very alive and so very certain that the best part of their lives is still ahead of them. And then I saw you, sitting quietly at the edge of it all, and I thought, there is someone who understands. Someone who has lived a full life already and is not pretending otherwise. I did not want to dance with anyone who hasn't yet learned what it means to lose something. I wanted to dance with someone who has." Eleanor felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. "My husband died 12 years ago," she said quietly. "Everyone tells me that part of my life is finished, that I should be content simply watching from the chairs." "Who told you that?" the Duke asked, frowning slightly. "Nearly everyone," Eleanor said, with a small, rueful laugh. "My sister-in-law mostly. She means well. She is wrong," he said simply, with such quiet certainty that Eleanor almost believed him on the spot. "Grief does not erase the part of us capable of loving again. It only teaches us to value it more carefully. I am Alistair, by the way. I should have introduced myself before asking you to dance, but I confess I was afraid that if I paused even a moment, I would lose my courage." "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Whitfield." They danced for the rest of the song, and then, when the quartet began another, they danced again. Eleanor found herself laughing, actually laughing, freely, the way she hadn't in years, as Alistair told her stories about the eccentric history of Hartmore Hall, about a great-aunt who had once kept a goat in the library, about his own clumsy attempts at gardening that had resulted in what he cheerfully called the Great Rose Massacre of 3 years ago. In return, she told him about her classroom of small, mismatched children, about Mr. Biscuit's habit of sitting directly on top of any book she tried to read, about the strange comfort of watching things grow in a garden when so much else in life felt impossible to control. By the time the gala began to wind down, Eleanor felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of, the light, fluttering feeling of being truly seen. But the warmth of the evening did not last past the drive home. Diana called the very next morning, her voice tight, with barely concealed disapproval. "Eleanor, really, the whole county is talking about it. A man like the Duke doesn't simply fall for a woman at a charity gala. It was a kindness, dear. Nothing more. Perhaps a publicity moment. Good for his charity's image. You mustn't read anything more into it. I'd hate to see you embarrassed." Eleanor said little in response, but after she hung up the phone, she found herself standing very still in her kitchen, the old doubts creeping back in like familiar, unwelcome guests. Perhaps Diana was right. Perhaps it had only been a kind gesture from a lonely man, nothing that would survive the morning light. She was still turning the thought over in her mind 2 days later when she heard a knock at her cottage door. Standing on her doorstep, dressed simply in a wool coat, with no driver or assistant in sight, was Alistair, holding a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said, looking slightly nervous in a way that struck Eleanor as entirely unlike the composed figure from the ballroom. "I considered sending a letter, but I found I wanted to see your face when I asked. I've thought of nothing but our conversation since the gala, and I find I would very much like to see you again. Not at a party, not in front of a crowd, simply you and I, if you'd allow it." Eleanor glanced down at the bundle in his hands. He unwrapped it to reveal a small clay pot containing a rose cutting, its roots carefully wrapped in damp cloth. "From the garden," he explained. "I thought, Given the state of my own roses, you might have better luck with it than I did." Eleanor laughed, and in that laugh, every lingering doubt Diana had planted began to quietly dissolve. She invited him in for tea. They talked for 3 hours that afternoon, the conversation winding easily between memories of the people they had loved and lost, hopes they had each quietly given up on, and small, unimportant things. Favorite books, terrible cooking attempts, the particular satisfaction of a well-tended garden in early summer. There was no performance in it, no need to impress. Only two people who had each believed, separately, that their chance at companionship had closed for good, slowly discovering they had been wrong. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Alistair saw each other often. They walked the grounds of Hartmore Hall together. They sat by her small fireplace while Mr. Biscuit dozed between them. When Diana made one more pointed comment about acting one's age, Eleanor found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer felt the need to shrink in response. "I am 68 years old, Diana," she said calmly, over tea one afternoon. "I have buried a husband I loved deeply, raised a family, and lived a full life already. That does not mean my life is finished. It means I know exactly what I am looking for, and I have been fortunate enough to find it again." Diana for once had nothing to say. Months later, at a small, quiet dinner at Hartmore Hall, no crowd, no chandeliers, no audience at all. The same waltz that had played at the gala drifted softly from an old record player in the corner of the room. Alistair held out his hand to Eleanor once more. "Shall we?" he asked, smiling. Eleanor took his hand without hesitation, and they danced slowly across the quiet room. Two people who had each believed their dancing days were behind them. It had taken one man crossing one ballroom to prove that some stories do not end when everyone assumes they should. Sometimes, they simply wait patiently for the right partner to finally ask.